So I've had the Nintendo Switch 2 for over a month now, and because my unboxing video did so well, I wanted to do a review on the system 1 month after using it. I feel like enough time has passed for me to give a proper review of the system and whether or not it's worth upgrading from the Switch 1. Now I've been using the Nintendo Switch since November 2019. I had the original launch day model and I bought the OLED model back in June of 2023. So I feel like this gives a good perspective on what I've experienced with the Switch and what I've seen change as I move to the Switch 2. Now, I'm not going to get too technical with this review in terms of listing out actual specs for every part of the Switch 2, but I want this to help the average consumer looking into possibly buying a Switch 2. If you're a tech nerd like I am, cool. You probably know what I'll be talking about when I talk about some parts of the system. Now, without further ado, let's get this video started. Hello everybody, my name is Nick and welcome back to a brand new video. Like you just heard me say, today I'm going to be making a review video on the Nintendo Switch 2 1 month after I purchased it. If this video interests you, go ahead and leave a like on this video and hit that subscribe button as well, and check out my channel for other types of random videos I put out. It's mostly gaming videos. I'd appreciate if you guys check out all the other stuff I put out on my channel. And now without further ado, let's begin with the review. Now I know some of you guys are probably asking this question, so let's get it out of the way. Is a Nintendo Switch 2 worth buying? Absolutely. However, there are a few things you have to keep in mind. First off, if you don't already own a Switch and are looking into getting a Switch 2, I would say go for the Switch 2. But keep in mind, it is expensive, coming in at $450 or $500 for the Mario Kart bundle. This is opposed to the Switch 1 costing $300 brand new, or $350 for the OLED model, or $200 for the Switch Lite. All these prices are brand new, by the way. You could probably find them cheaper used on eBay. If you have money to spare, then yes, the Switch 2 is worth buying. I would definitely recommend the Mario Kart bundle, as you save quite a bit of money buying the bundle as opposed to buying the system alone, then getting the game later. But that's entirely up to you. And the same can be said to anyone who owns a Switch 1 right now. If you have money to spare and you want a Switch 2, go for it. You will notice some quality of life upgrades that are nice to have. But are they entirely worth it? That depends on your personal preferences. If you own a Switch 1 right now, but you're not on the idea of getting a Switch 2, then I would say you're not missing out on much. Just a bigger system with a much better quality screen, bigger and better quality Joy-Cons, much better hardware, a new library of games, and a few other things amongst that. I know I made it sound like a lot, but it's not worth it for everyone. And if you're okay with your Switch 1 and you're not looking on upgrading, I would say just stick with what you already have. I bought mine because the temptation was too much, so I just gave in. And also, I'm using Klarna to pay off my Switch 2, so I'm okay for now. So now that we got the price out of the way and whether or not it's worth upgrading to for everybody, let's talk about what I've noticed going from the Switch 1 to the Switch 2. Here I'm really going to list all the aspects that I found were different from the Switch 1. Right off the bat, the first thing that I noticed was how much bigger the Switch 2 really was compared to the Switch 1. Now the model of my Switch 1 that I have is the OLED Switch, which in terms of size dimensions, it's exactly the same as the launch day Switch or the LCD Switch. The only difference is that the screen size is slightly larger than the LCD Switch, and of course the much better quality screen. Speaking of better quality screen, the screen on the Switch 2 is noticeably better than the Switch 1, and that's just with the OLED model. Imagine how much bigger of a difference it would be with the LCD Switch 1, which also has me wondering what an OLED Switch 2 will look like if Nintendo ever makes one. And yes, the Switch 2 does have an LCD screen, and that was something that threw me off a bit when they first announced the system. But when you actually have an OLED Switch and a Switch 2 side by side, the screen is so much better on the Switch 2. If you don't know what I mean by LCD or OLED, it's just basically a type of screen. And normally OLED looks a lot better, but in this case, the Switch 2 LCD is miles better than the Switch 1 OLED. And that's because the Switch 1 OLED only has a 720p screen, while the Switch 2 has a 1080p screen. And when you have them side by side, you can see the difference. The Switch 2 outputs a much higher resolution in TV and handheld mode. The Switch 2 can output up to 1080p at 120 frames per second in handheld mode, and up to 4K and 60 frames per second in TV mode, while the Switch 1 outputs in 720p in handheld mode and 1080p in TV mode, both being 60 frames per second. And you can tell the difference, especially in handheld mode. The Switch 2 in general has a much bigger and better screen than the Switch 1. And again, this is only the OLED model. if I had it next to the LCD model, the difference would be a lot bigger. Even comparing them size-wise, I'm amazed how much smaller the Switch 1 is compared to the Switch 2. To think that's what I was using for so many years, it's a little hard to go back to, but since I'm using my Switch 1 for a new Animal Crossing island, I think I'll be able to adjust between the two of them just fine. Speaking of, next up, let's talk about the Joy-Cons. This might be something that people might have mixed feelings about, and I'll explain that in just a bit. Right off the bat, like the system and the screen, the Joy-Cons itself are a lot bigger, and because of their size difference, they feel a lot higher quality. When I pulled out my Switch 1 Joy-Cons for the first time in 3 weeks, I was blown away by how much smaller the Switch 1 Joy-Cons were. Almost felt like I was holding air. Okay, maybe that's exaggerating it a bit, but my point is the Switch 2 Joy-Cons are noticeably bigger. And because of how much bigger they are, the quality of the analog sticks and buttons are much better. For me, the biggest difference I noticed was the SL and SR buttons on the side of the Joy-Con. They are noticeably bigger and a lot better quality. That was a complaint I had about those buttons on the Switch 1 Joy-Cons. They were just way too small, and that's why a lot of people used the wrist strap attachments when they used the Joy-Cons individually. Speaking of better quality, the Switch 2 Joy-Cons don't get stick drift. Now, to be fair, I've only had my Switch 2 for a month, but the system itself has been out for over 8 months, and a lot of people are reporting that even after all this time, their Joy-Cons have not experienced stick drift. If y'all remember when the Switch 1 launched back in 2017, people were reporting stick drift on their Joy-Cons not long after purchasing the system, and that was a big problem, to the point where they had to open up a repair program for Joy-Cons completely free of charge. Still to this day, in 2026, you can still send your Switch 1 Joy-Cons in for repair for free. It doesn't matter what kind of damage they have. I've done it twice back in 2021 and in 2023. Nintendo and free are probably two words you wouldn't expect to hear in the same sentence in 2026, but here we are. My point is the Switch 2 Joy-Cons haven't experienced any form of stick drift yet as the Switch 1 did, so that's always good to know. Now earlier I mentioned some people might have mixed feelings about the Switch 2 Joy-Cons. Why? Well, let's talk about it. First off, the magnets. This is how you attach and detach your Switch 2 Joy-Cons, as opposed to sliding them in and out on the Switch 1. At first, I wasn't too sure how to feel about this, but I actually like them a lot better than the sliding. They're a lot easier to attach and detach, and actually takes way less time. On the Switch 2, you just push on the button on the back of the Joy-Con for the magnets, and you attach them and pull them out of the system, whereas on the Switch 1, you have to push the button on the back of the Joy-Con, which is a lot smaller than the magnet button, and you slide them, and it just takes a lot longer. Durability-wise, the magnets sound like they could break the Joy-Cons a lot easier if one tries to aggressively pull them out of the system. And this is probably a concern to someone who's probably thinking of getting this to a young child. I even had this concern when they first unveiled the system. But I could assure you guys that the magnets are super strong and won't pull off that easily. So if your kid tries to yank the Joy-Cons off, they're not gonna budge. Even the concept of the magnets threw some people off, since they're used to sliding them on the Switch 1, which is understandable, but with enough time, you'll get used to it. Now, this isn't to say that the magnets are better than the sliding method. For me personally, I like the magnets better, but this is one of those aspects that'll just come down to personal preferences. Some people will like the magnets better, some people will like them sliding better, that's okay. Both were great in my opinion, but I'm more fond of the magnets. Now, here's another reason that people have mixed feelings about the Joy-Cons, and this threw a lot of people off, including myself, and that is that the Joy-Cons don't have color. Sort of. As you can see here, my Switch 1 has red and blue Joy-Cons, and they look very nice, and if you look at the Switch 2, the Joy-Cons are black. Now, to be fair, the Switch 1 also did have a pair of black Joy-Cons as well. However, if you look at the Switch 2 Joy-Cons, they have color under the analog sticks and on the sides, and that's it. That's what they call their colored Joy-Cons, and a lot of people don't like that since it makes the system look a lot more dull compared to the Switch 1. Even just recently, Nintendo announced a new set of Switch 2 Joy-Cons in purple and green that are supposed to release in February. As you can see, the only colors are, again, under the analog sticks and on the sides. So, at least for right now, the Switch 2 Joy-Cons, they're not exactly so colorful. Now, me personally, that was another thing that threw me off about the Switch 2 when it was first unveiled. But after some time, I've gotten used to it. I think the size and quality have heavily made up for it. Now, who knows if Nintendo will ever color the Switch 2 Joy-Cons as they did with the Switch 1, or even add a variety of cool designs like a bunch of Switch 1 Joy-Cons have. But if they don't, you could probably find a bunch of skins for the Switch 2 Joy-Cons on places like Dbrand, and it would probably make your Joy-Cons look a lot more cooler and colorful. One final feature I forgot to touch on the Joy-Cons were the mouse controls. Now, this isn't too big of a feature in my opinion, but it does have its uses. For me, the biggest use for it is with the new Switch 2 version of Animal Crossing. You can select more than one piece of furniture and drag it around all at once to another area using those mouse controls. I've used them a few times. It's nice to have, but it's not a feature I'm too crazy about. Now again, this all comes down to personal preferences. Some of y'all might like it a lot and find a lot of uses for it. Now, before I go on to talk about the Switch 2's performance, let's talk about some other quality of life upgrades I appreciate. First off, the dual USB-C ports. Now, I haven't had to use the top one just yet, but I imagine if I ever need to charge my Switch 2 with the kickstand out, it won't be a huge inconvenience like the Switch 1. I feel like my only use for that is if I'm ever on a long airplane ride, or if I'm playing multiplayer handheld with someone, and that doesn't happen too often. Speaking of the kickstand, I like the new design of it. Now, the Switch OLED's kickstand wasn't bad. In fact, both the Switch OLED and Switch 2 have a much better kickstand than the LCD model of the Switch 1. If you remember that kickstand, it was way too small and would always keep breaking off. I even had to buy a replacement kickstand for my first Switch model back in 2021. And that's because one of the screws on the kickstand came off, so it just would not stay on the back of the Switch. So yeah, the OLED Switch was a huge improvement in terms of that. But the Switch 2 also improved on that as well. Another thing I like better with the Switch 2 design is the cartridge door. It's a lot easier to open on the Switch 2 than it was on the regular Switch. Now here on my Switch OLED, since I don't have nails, it's very hard for me to open the door to the cartridges. In fact, most of the time I had to use a box cutter. Now with the Switch 2, there's a bigger gap for you to fit your finger through for you to be able to open that cartridge door. So it's so much easier to open the cartridge door, and that way a lot of times I don't contemplate wanting to open that door because now it's just so easy, at least for me, on the Switch 2. So even if you're someone without nails, then your problem's solved there. Another nice feature that isn't exactly life-changing, sort of, except for in Animal Crossing, is the microphone. With the Switch 2 upgrade of Animal Crossing New Horizons, they added the megaphone to take advantage of the Switch 2's microphone. Now that's something I've actually been wanting to see for years in this game, as it made it so much easier to find your villagers like in Animal Crossing New Leaf. So it's nice to have that microphone, so maybe it kind of is life-changing. A few other things are the GameCube Nintendo Classics app, which I've been wanting to see for years, even though I already have a GameCube. Still, it's nice to play my childhood games handheld. I should note that you need the expansion pack for Nintendo Switch Online for that. The built-in storage is also so much better. 256 gigabytes versus 32 on the launch day Switch model, or 64 on the OLED Switch. I had an SD card on my Switch anyways, but still, the extra memory is nice to have, especially because, for now, I'll need to buy an SD card for my Switch 2. And if you know anything about SD cards with a decent amount of memory, they cost a bit. In fact, your Switch 2 can only use a certain type of SD card, being micro SD express cards. As you can see here, they're quite expensive, ranging anywhere between $60 to $75. So, at least for now, the upgraded built-in storage is nice to have. Also, the library of games is pretty nice. I only have 2 Switch 2 games right now, being Mario Kart World and Donkey Kong Bonanza, and honestly, they're enough to keep me occupied, especially DK Bonanza. And also, considering how expensive Switch 2 games are, maybe it's a good thing I only have 2 games for now, but we'll talk about that later. Alright, now let's touch on the most important thing about the Nintendo Switch 2, which is performance. How does this system perform? And while I'm happy to report, this thing runs incredibly. Something that people complained so much about on the original Switch, including myself, was performance. It was okay at first, but as time went on, more third-party games made their way to the Switch. It was starting to fall behind in terms of graphics and performance. For me, this was most apparent on the GTA, the Definitive Edition. It ran horribly on the Switch. Even some basic things like launching games like Animal Crossing took forever on the Switch. Thankfully, most of this is fixed on the Switch 2. Launching games and loading into them are so much faster on the Switch 2, it made me realize how much time I really wasted waiting for Animal Crossing to load. In fact, here I'm gonna put side by side a comparison with the Switch OLED versus the Switch 2 launching Animal Crossing. And as you can see, it's a lot faster on the Switch 2. Although I feel like loading times have definitely improved on the Switch 1 with the new 3.0 update, so that's nice to see. Even the GTA Definitive Edition looks and runs a lot better on the Switch 2. But unfortunately, still no 60 frames per second for any of these games. And I feel like the Switch 2 is really missing out on that. Even again, basic tasks like launching into games and loading them up are much faster on the Switch 2. Even the Nintendo eShop loads miles faster on the Switch 2, and that was another thing I had a problem with on my Switch 1. However, there is a catch to all of this. The Switch 2 is still nowhere near as powerful as a PS5, Xbox Series X, or even a PC, but it's still a huge improvement over the Switch 1. And also, considering it's a handheld, I'm okay with it. I was actually going to say that you can make an argument for the Steam Deck, but while I was doing some research for this video, I actually found out that these two are actually not that far apart in terms of performance, which actually surprised me. Now, are there any things I don't like about the Switch 2? Yes. First and foremost, and probably the most obvious thing, it's very expensive. Again, you're looking at $450 or $500 if you get the Mario Kart bundle. Even the games and accessories alone are expensive. Most games will run you $70, and if you don't choose to get the Mario Kart bundle, you're looking at possibly spending $80 on this game. And don't even get me started on the accessories. A Switch 2 Pro controller will run you about $90. Individual Joy-Cons are $55. And the dock set will run you about $125. There's more accessories here, but these are just the basic ones you'll probably need. Well, probably only the Switch Pro controller if you really want it. But if you lose or break your dock or your Joy-Cons, a brand new pair will cost you a bit. So yeah, this system, the games, and the accessories are expensive. So you have to invest quite a bit of money into this system if you want it. And this is if you buy them brand new, by the way. You could probably find them cheaper used on eBay. But considering the system is only 8 months old, they probably aren't that much cheaper. But still, it never hurts to take a look. And yes, I see that camera there. I know Game Chat is a new feature on the Switch 2, but I don't ever use it, so I'm not even gonna bother talking about it. Also, another thing I don't like, and I know this is a very minor thing, but YouTube is not compatible on the Switch 2, and this thing has been out for 8 months now. Now, to be fair, YouTube didn't launch on Switch 1 until November 2018, 1 year and 8 months after the system launched. But because they've already gone into work on Switch 1 for so many years, you would think they would have already had it ready on Switch 2. But I guess not. Again, this is kind of a minor thing. I almost don't use YouTube on my Switch, but still the convenience of having it is still nice. Now, they probably will add it eventually, we just don't know when. Alright, now I know there I talked about backwards compatibility and how YouTube wasn't working, but let me assure you guys, for those of you who are wondering if your Switch titles will work on the Switch 2, yes, a majority of them will work, which is like 99.9% of all your Switch games. This is if you have a Switch 1 and you're thinking of upgrading, you don't have to worry about that. I think Nintendo might have a way on their website where you can check what games are not compatible, but all the games that I have for my Switch 1 work on my Switch 2, so it's nice that I can still play them. Alright, so I think I've just about covered everything I needed to cover for this review. So, what are my final thoughts on the Switch 2 1 month after owning it? Overall, I love it. I've been using it a lot to play Animal Crossing, Mario Kart World, Donkey Kong Bonanza, and a bunch of other games, and it's great. The bigger screen and better performance make my experience so much better, amongst those other features that I mentioned. So was it worth upgrading to from the Switch 1? For me personally, yes, 100%. What about you guys? Maybe you're looking into buying a Switch 2 and you're feeling a little hesitant. Well, here's what I would recommend. If you own a Switch 1 and you're looking into buying the Switch 2, if you have money to spare, I would say go for it. All those new features will be nice to have. However, in my personal opinion, I would say if you already own a Switch 1 Pro controller, keep it. It still works great on the Switch 2, and it's honestly not much different than a Switch 2 Pro controller, other than not having a C button, the audio jack, or the back buttons. Unless your Pro controller is broken in some form or you really want the Switch 2 Pro controller, I'd say go for it. It's your money at the end of the day, but that's just what I think. They're not that much different. Now, if you own a Switch 1, but you're hesitant on upgrading because you don't have money or for some other reason, then I would say just keep your Switch 1. The new features, yeah, they're nice to have, but I know they're not worth spending $450 for everyone. I'd say you're doing just fine on your Switch 1. If you don't have a Switch at all and you're thinking of getting one, I'd say go for the Switch 2. Or if you don't care and you want to save a bit of money, you can buy a Switch 1. But I would say don't buy it brand new. Buy it on some places like eBay. You could find them used. They're a lot cheaper than if you buy them brand new. Just keep in mind, Nintendo will end services for the Switch a lot earlier than the Switch 2, but for now, it should still be fine for a good while. Now, this thing I'm about to say is super important. If you're on the verge of buying a Switch 2, but you're holding off or waiting for something to make you buy the system, now's probably not a good time to wait around, because rumors are going around that the Switch 2 will go up in price later this year. And that's thanks to our good friend AI for causing a RAM shortage, and of course, tariffs. So if you've been thinking about buying a Switch 2 for a while, now's probably the time to do it. And although Nintendo hasn't said anything yet, analysts are predicting that it's very likely a price increase will happen later this year. So just keep an eye out for that if you're thinking of buying a Switch 2 in the near future. Alright, well, there's my Switch 2 review 1 month after buying it. I hope that you guys found this review useful. If you like this video, hit that like button and hit that subscribe button as well. I have other types of videos I make as well if you're interested, so I would totally appreciate if you guys check that out. On that note, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you guys in the next video. Peace.